I've learned a lot about God's character. I've learned to trust his character. The Bible is so clear that if God says he's faithful, he can only act one way. He has to be faithful. If God says he's merciful and just and gracious, then he's going to act that way.
For churches that are close to some of these distribution centers, talk about how they can volunteer or serve or even be part of an experience that helps them engage with what it is that you're doing.
So if the church is local, close enough to us in Los Angeles, Dallas, or San Antonio, there's several ways the church can engage. We have churches that bring their youth groups in. They bring their adult Sunday school classes in to come and volunteer. We have volunteer work days multiple times a week where we encourage them to come in and assemble food packs and help us prepare the food that will be ultimately given to churches that will use it in their home delivery program. In Los Angeles, we also have an exhibit that we built on global poverty called the Poverty Encounter. It's been open now just about 5 years, and that's a 75-minute immersive experience that we have churches and corporations and the general public that goes through. And that's an experience where it was really designed for students to educate them on the reality of global poverty, some of the challenges that children living in poverty have. And it really is created to introduce that visitor or guest to the fact that God is a personal God. He loves the poor, and so should we. And God's instrument for change in the life of the poor is the local church. And so we have these immersive sets that demonstrate different aspects of poverty. We show a child that lives in a trash dump and talk about hunger and malnutrition. We have another set that's a recreation of the earthquake in Haiti and talk about what education looks like for a child in that environment. And in every immersive set, we introduce the local church and how the church comes alongside and cares for kids and families in crisis. But churches that are outside of our area, you can go online and fill a food pack virtually. You can fill a food pack by having us ship an empty case pack to you, and you can fill it as a family or a Bible study or as a church. We have Project Food Pack opportunities going on around the country all the time. We just did one in Dallas this last week where a church filled 15,000 food packs for us. So, so many ways churches can engage, but ultimately we really want to encourage churches not just to be a resource for the poor, but to consider engaging the poor directly. If they're in an area where there are pockets of poverty and there's a heart to serve those families and to engage them in a relationship, and if the church is equipped and educated their congregation to integrate the poor into their church family, then we'd love to partner with them and help resource them to be successful.
That's so good. You know, you've been doing this now for 32 years. What has God done in your heart? Obviously, it's been a tremendous faith journey, and stories like, phone calls from people saying, I need this cancer drug, to phone calls of, how do I get rid of this cancer drug? Those things increase your faith, but there've got to be so many little mile markers along the way where you've learned about the faithfulness of God. What has God done in your heart over the last 32 years in just your understanding of God's provision for the poor, his heart for the poor, where the local church should be connected with the poor? Just walk us through kind of where you are right now, spiritually speaking, because for many of us, it's just, there's people that are hurting somewhere else, but I got my own problems to deal with.
Yeah, Rusty, I think when I reflect on my own spiritual journey the last 32 years, I count it such a privilege to be a part of an organization that I think is really in a sweet spot because we serve the local church, and Scripture is so clear in how much God loves his bride, the church. And the other sweet spot is it's so clear that God is the father to the fatherless. He has such a special place in his heart for children that have been disadvantaged, have been orphaned, that have been abused, that have been abandoned. God just has a special place in his heart for that population in our world, and for us to be able to serve that population through the vehicle of the local church. I know that we get to see the heart of God on display in ways that most people never get to see. And so, yeah, I've learned a lot about God's character. I've learned to trust his character. The Bible is so clear that if God says he's faithful, he can only act one way. He has to be faithful. If God says he's merciful and just and gracious, then he's going to act that way. And so for 32 years, I've had the blessing of just witnessing that on such a large scale. I think of so many times over the last 30 years where I've been overwhelmed by the magnitude of poverty. I've been overwhelmed by the brokenness that sin creates in the heart of man, and how that sinfulness touches the life of innocent children. I remember back 30 years ago when communism fell in the former Soviet Union, we had a chance to go over and spend 2 or 3 weeks in visiting all of the state-run orphanages that were just in need of food. And we were invited into these orphan homes to, if we provided food, that we could come in and bring the gospel and have the churches come in and share the gospel with us. And so this one event where we were over there, it was October, and I probably visited 30 or 40 orphanages, and every single orphanage director said the same thing, Rusty. They said, you know, the winter is coming, the government's going to cut off the heat, and our kids, many of them won't survive the winter. You need to do something to help. And after hearing that 35 or 40 times, I was flying home from Russia and just with a broken heart, crying out to God, going, Lord, this problem is so much bigger than us. How can we help? And I remember coming home, and the next day I got home, and the first thing I did was go into the office, and there was a fax sitting in my fax machine from a company that we all know, Hanes, that makes, you know, underwear and T-shirts. And Hanes just in this fax said, Dave, we just had this overrun of product where the coloring of the product is a little off and we can't sell it, but want to know if you could use it. And it was 2 million sets of children's long underwear. 2 million. And it was something like 100 semi-loads. And over the next 2 winters, we were able to place that in every orphanage throughout the former Soviet Union. And it was all distributed by local churches, working with other Christian ministries. And that was done on a scale that I would have never imagined. Who's able to do that? You know, in our humanness, that isn't even possible. But in God, all things are possible. And, you know, that's just one example of some of the things that God has done in recent years. You know, I think of COVID, right? And, you know, about a month before COVID hit, I just had a sense that it was going to become something on a large scale. And if it was a global issue, that the poor was really going to be hit the hardest. And we go into COVID about 6 weeks before COVID. We're running about $1 million behind on our budget and coming up on our fiscal year end. And not knowing what's going to happen, we're thinking, man, maybe we're going to have to cut, you know, staff by 30, 40%. And I remember just praying to God and saying, Lord, you've been on this journey with us for 30 years, and I don't know why you would abandon us now. Is there any way you could put us in a position, not just to survive COVID, but could you put us in a position to thrive and to serve your church around the world, knowing there's going to be needs? And Rusty, there was so much that God did in the month of March and April, what was that, 2020, when COVID hit. We needed to raise something like $2 million to make budget in the last five weeks of the year. And God brought in almost $7 million.
Wow.
And it put us in a position to be generous at a time when most ministries weren't able to be generous. And
right.
The other thing that God did in the months, the first quarter of that year, we had all these large churches filling food packs for us. And all 3 of our distribution centers had more inventory of food packs than we've ever had in our history. I mean, we had tens of thousands of food packs. And Lynn reminds me, I came home one day from work and I was kind of frustrated. I said, I don't understand why our warehouses are overloaded with food packs. We're not a warehouse, we're a distribution center. You know, our staff needs to get these things out to the churches. And Lynn was like, well, what are you going to do about it? And I go, look, I trust my team. You know, they'll take care of it. And then COVID hits. And during COVID, those first several months, we couldn't fill one food pack. We couldn't bring any volunteers into our facility to package food packs. Churches weren't gathering. There was no capacity to get food packs. And so those food packs, God stretched for a 10-month period.
Wow.
Where we didn't miss one delivery date to our churches in the U.S. or around the world. Every single one of our international church partnerships, we had to pivot to an in-country purchase model rather than shipping food packs. And God just accomplished all that in less than 30 days once COVID hit. And there were so many miracles that God did in that. But in addition to that, what God did in corporate America, right after COVID hit, we couldn't find food anywhere. We were calling all of our food manufacturers. They're like, man, you know what's going on with Costco. You know, everything's going out the back door as fast as it comes in. So we're selling not only all of our merchandise, but even the short dated product is going out. So if you want food and you want to purchase it, it might take us 6 months to fulfill your purchase orders. And that's the way we walked into COVID. And about 4 weeks into it, probably the end of April, one day Nestle Food called us. The next day Dole Food calls us, and then Del Monte. And they said, Dave, all the national restaurants are closed, all the chains are closed, and we've got shiploads of food we don't know what to do with.
Wow.
Can you guys use it? And I remember, I think it was Dole Foods said, you know, we can give you 1,800 pallets a week for the next 20 weeks. And we started getting food on a scale that was unprecedented. During that year, in fact, in the last 3 years, our corporate gifts of food donations have gone from about $40 million a year to last year, I think we distributed $155 million worth of food. And that food provided over 100 million meals to children and through church distributions across the U.S. and on a global basis. And
wow,
that's just God being faithful. That's God demonstrating his heart for the poor, his heart for that child that has been victimized by what's going on in our world. And that's the God we serve, Rusty. And I'll brag about my God all day long because I think the biggest thing that God has taught me in 30 years is God is so much bigger than what you and I can even imagine. And he wants to put himself on display. It's just that we often don't give him that opportunity to do that.
wow. Well, he's certainly doing that with Children's Hunger Fund.